Briefly, Professor Youval Rotman is a professor of history in the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University. His scholarship focuses on social and cultural processes in the Mediterranean and in the Near East in the first millennium under the Roman and the Byzantine rule. He wrote extensively, no less than the previous lecturer, a number of books, but I will mention just briefly the titles. His first book is Byzantine Slavery and the Mediterranean World. The second is the Ambiguity of Religious Experience that was published in Harvard in 2006 and 16. And I will mention also one of the others, his book, Trees and Spirits, Anthropological Study of Animism in Myanmar, that was published recently in Hebrew by Magnus Press. Another book which is very dear to me is his anthology, The Cave of Treasures, Syriac Anthology from Late Antiquity to Hebrew, from Late Antiquity in Hebrew translation. In Hebrew, it is entitled Me'arat HaOtzarot, Antologia Lesifrut Surit Mishlei Ha'et Ha'atika. Professor Rotman serves as the head of the Rosenberg School of Jewish Studies and Archaeology at Tel Aviv University and has founded the Koret Center for Jewish Civilization, for which he is currently serves as the academic director. He will speak to us today on Africa and the medieval map of human trafficking. And we have trafficking. And we have for his lecture and the discussion, half an hour.
No, 40 minutes. Okay. I have, as I followed your instructions, I prepared a lecture of 30 minutes, more or less. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you for the organizer. And special thanks to our colleagues who came from abroad in this very chaotic and disturbing time. It's not a given, and we're really grateful to have you here with us. The research of the past 20 years has radically changed our view on slavery. A major contribution to this movement has been the scholarship on medieval slavery. To historians of medieval Islam in Africa, it comes as no surprise that slavery played an important role in medieval societies, and you see here the slave trade of Yemen from the manuscript of Al-Khariri's Al-Makamat in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Yet up until recently, medieval forms of slavery were not treated on the same level of importance as ancient and modern slavery. No one denied the existence of medieval slavery, but it was considered as marginal to the socio-economic structure and with no comparison to other periods. Today, this perspective is no longer tenable. This is mainly thanks to historians, mainly medieval historians, that have revealed the diversity of the definition of slavery, its different forms and versatile character. This helped to identify the different roles it played in history. One of these roles was as means of connection between different economies through human merchandising and trafficking. Human trafficking is defined by the 2003 UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons as follows. Human trafficking is the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving individuals through force, fraud, deception, or coercion for the purpose of their exploitation. This exploitation may include forced labor, sexual slavery, or other forms of commercial sexual exploitation. The pre-modern world definitely knew slave trade on an international scale, but did it sum up to a major force of economic development of pre-modern societies, as in the modern Atlantic? In this paper, I would like to consider societies that are usually absent from the economic discussion of human trafficking and to focus on enslaved Africans and their place in the global medieval map of human trafficking. I will focus on the Central Middle Ages, the 8th to the 11th centuries, a period that witnessed the creation of an international network of human trafficking that connected Scandinavia, the Caucasus, the Steppe, Anatolia, the Balkans, Italy, Francia, Al-Andalus, Ireland, North Africa, the Sahel, and Iraq. The following description from 11th century description from 11th century Baghdad exemplify this. In his treatise, Introduction to the Art of Making Good Purchases of Slaves, Ibn Butlan, an 11th century Baghdadi physician, documented his following insights. I read, Indian women are meek and mild, but they rapidly fade away. They are excellent breeders of children. They have one advantage over other women. It is said, on divorce, they become virgins again. The men are good house managers and experts in fine handicrafts, but they are apt to die for apoplexy at an earlier age. They are mostly brought from Kandahar. The women of Sindh are noted for slim waist and long hair. The woman of Medina combines suavity and grace with coquetry and humor. She is neither jealous nor bad-tempered nor quarrelsome. She makes an excellent songstress. The Meccan woman is delicate, has small ankles and wrists and languishes eyes. The Berber woman is unrivaled for breeding. Pliant to a degree, she accommodates herself to every kind of work. According to the broker Abu Othman, the ideal slave is a Berber girl who is exported out of a country at the age of 9, who spends 3 years at Medina and 3 at Mecca, and at 16 comes to Mesopotamia to be trained in elegant accomplishments, and thus, when sold at 25, she unites with the fine racial excellences, the coquetry of the Medinian, the delicacy of the Meccan, and the culture of the Mesopotamian woman. At the markets, blacks are much in evidence. The darker, the uglier, and the more pointed their teeth. They are not up to much. They are fickle and careless. Dancing and beating time are ingrained in their nature. They say, were the black to fall from heaven to the earth, he would beat time in falling. They have the whitest teeth, and this because they have much saliva. Unpleasant in the smell emitted from their armpits, and coarse is their skin. The Abyssinian woman, on the other hand, is weak and flabby, and frequently suffers from consumption. She is ill-suited for song and dance, and languishes in a foreign country. She is reliable and has a strong character in a feeble body. The women of the Beja has golden complexion, comely countenances, delicate skin, but an unlovely figure. They must be taken out of the country before circumcision, for often it is done so clumsy that the bones become visible. It becomes more and more disturbing. The men are brave but are prone to steal, and so they should not be... No? Oh, it's here, okay. They should not be trusted with money. And for this reason, precisely, they make bad house managers. Of all the blacks, the Nubian woman is the most adaptable and cheerful. Egypt agrees with her, for as at home, she drinks the Nile water there too. Elsewhere, she is liable to the diseases of the blood. She is preferable as a nurse because she is kind and tender to the child and does not have a sharp tongue. Some physicians choose the Zanj women for suckling because the warmth of the breast makes the milk properly cooked. Fair-skinned, the Turkish women are full of grace and animation, and etc. I will not read it, the entire thing. It goes on for pages. Ibn Butlan's descriptions combine slavery, proto-racism, misogyny, and objectification of women into an ideological economic framework, where origin, ethnicity, colors are used here to create social cultural distinction between humans that justifies a system of subjugation, domination, and enslavement. As for human trafficking, Ibn Butlan's descriptions reveals an international network of trade that made this market possible. Indeed, the main source for slaves in the Central Middle Ages has changed from wars to commerce. Our main literary sources are Greek, Latin, and Arabic descriptions of medieval historians, geographers, and private documents of different sorts. There was a good reason why the slave trade became so dominant. In all three monotheistic religions, enslaving of fellow co-religionists became illegal, and this medieval monotheistic norm pushed the slave traders further away towards pagan regions. And here's some kind of a map that I will get to and elaborate on in the following. In Islam, the concept of the Muslim society of society of believers, the Ummah, had major consequences on slavery. It eliminated the possibility of enslaving Arabs, who became free fellow Muslims. Used to own and trade in slaves for their everyday life and their socioeconomic position, the Arabs, they needed to look elsewhere. Sources that narrate the Arabic Muslim conquests and the continuous wars that followed paint a similar picture. Through the conquest, the newcomers acquired means to enslave their opponents. Several treaties that were signed ensured an annual slave supply to the caliphate. A case in point is the Baqt, the treaty between Muslim Egypt and Christian Nubian kingdom of Makuria, allegedly from the mid-7th century. The term derived probably from the Greek pacton and the Latin pactum. In an epistle, papyrus sent by the governor of Egypt to the Nubian king in 7758, the author, the papyrus from Qasar Ibrahim, the author complains that the agreement is not maintained by the Nubians, who do not send a yearly amount of slaves to Egypt. The Egyptians view the Baqt as a binding diplomatic arrangement requiring the Nubians to deliver goods, including slaves. And when slave deliveries ceased in the 8th century, they responded in raids in Nubian territories. Who were the enslaved? The 10th century Hudud al-Alam state that Egyptian merchants stole children from among the Sudan, south of Nubia, and that they castrated boys before entering Egypt. And this is important because castration of male was prohibited in Islam as well as in Christianity and Judaism. This was complemented by raids of semi-private militias of gold and slave merchants from Egypt. Such was the raids of Abdallah Abd al-Hamid al-Umari, who supplied Nubian slave, Rakik in the source, in the mid-9th century to Aswan. In fact, most of the Arabic papyri from the 8th to 11th century that concern slavery, edited by Yusuf Ragib and more recently by Yele Bruning, stipulate the Nubian origins of the slaves, both of women and men. Enslaved Nubians were also used in the army of Ibn Tulun, trained as infantry units. They tended to constitute the greater part of the army, with the more expensive Turks forming the cavalry. There was a reason for this difference in prices, and we'll get to that in the following. More to the south, between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea and Eritrea, the land of the Beja was also a source of enslaved Africans. Located in the eastern desert along trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa and the Nile Valley, they used both the Nile and the ports of the Red Sea, as described by Al-Yaqubi and Ibn Khawkal and Al-Muqaddasi, who mentioned the raids they conducted that provided slaves to the caliphate's market by connecting Nubia and Eritrea to the port of Sailak in Somalia, on the Gulf of Aden. The Beja's relationship with the Islamic Caliphate was shaped by treaties similar to the Egyptian Nubian Baqt that included provisions of slaves as part of tribute or trade agreements. They attest to increasing demand for slaves in the Caliphate for military and agricultural purposes, and this brings us to the Zanj. Ibn Khawkal situates the Zanj along the East African coast, south of Nubia and the Horn of Africa. It's not on the map. This is what happened when you invite a Byzantinist to a conference on Africa, who starts from Constantinople and goes down. And I didn't expect to go as down, so in my map there's not the Swahili coast doesn't show. This area corresponds to the Swahili coast, which was part of the broader Indian Ocean trade network. He identifies the Zanj as inhabitants of the African region in proximity to the Indian Ocean, from where they were trafficked to Iraq. According to Al-Tabari, the Zanj were exploited in great quantities in drainage of salt marshes in southern Iraq, as well as in the cultivation of these lands and the transport of rural products. Their owners lived in towns of southern Iraq and used local managers to control thousands of enslaved Zanj who worked on their lands. The revolts in southern Iraq in the 7th, 8th, and 9th century suggest that slavery had a central role in the economy of the early caliphate. Moving on to North Africa. Since the pioneering study of Elizabeth Savage on the Ibadi slave traffic in the 8th century, numerous scholars were interested in mapping the Trans-Saharan slave trade routes. John Wright, Saleh Rabelsi, Virginie Prevost, Anne Howe, David McKinley, and more recently, Cyril Ayet. I will try to summarize the studies, which are based on literary texts of historians, geographers, and geographers from Iraq to Al-Andalus, and as well as on Ibadi responsa and archaeological findings. Less on archaeological findings. Starting from the end of the 7th century, and more so in the 8th and the 9th centuries, when the population of North Africa became predominantly Muslim, Muslim slave traders turned to procure slaves first to the Berber people of North Africa, and then with their conversion to Islam and the foundation of the Ibadi Imamate to the commercial centers in South Sahara. Through the Sahara towns Sijil Massa in the Western Sahara, modern Morocco, Ouagala to Gant, Radames and Zawila in Fezzan and Cahors, down there. Just a second. A network of trade routes connected the South and Sub-Sahara to the markets of North Africa, the markets of Tlemcen, Taret, Kairouan, Sfax, and Tripoli. Sijil Massa played an active role in the Trans-Saharan slave trade to Tahirt. A known passage of Ibn Sajir described 9th century Tahirt as a prosperous and cosmopolitan city inhabiting merchants from Basra, Kufa, and Kairouan, who settled in the Ostumid city. Part of the trade was done in humans. The geographer Al-Yaqubi described it in details. And we read, beyond Wadan, to the south is the town of Zawila. Its people are Muslims, all of them Ibadiyah, and go on pilgrimage to Mecca. They export black slaves from among the Miryun, the Zarwiyun, the Marwiyun, and from other peoples of the Sudan because they live close to Zawila, whose people capture them. The kings of the Sudan sell their people without any pretext of war. Zawila is a land of date palms where sorghum and other grains are sown. Various people live there from Khorasan, Al-Basra, Al-Kufa. 15 days journey from beyond Zawila is a town called Cahors, inhabited by Muslims from various tribes, most of them Berbers. It is they who bring in the blacks, Sudan. This and other sources attest to the large scale of trans-Saharan human trafficking, in particular in the period when it was dominated by Berber Ibadi traders. The markets were obviously those of North Africa, but not exclusively. Al-Yaqubi, for example, mentions in this description the various people who lived in Zawila of Eastern origin, from Khorasan, Al-Basra, and Al-Kufa. They acted most probably as commercial agents. Al-Andalus, too, was one of the richest markets of slaves on the central medieval map, and imported African slave, Abid, through North Africa. It also imported Sakaliba, slaves of Eastern European origin or further to the east, to whom we will get in a moment. In fact, there was a North African itinerary for human trafficking to connect between West and East. The itineraries that were used to trade in enslaved African from South and the Sub-Saharan to the North Africa were parts of an international network of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean markets of North Africa to Southern Europe, from the West to the Near East, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. A detailed description of the itineraries that connected the Western Mediterranean to the Near East, leading up to the Far East, is given by the mid-9th century geographer Ibn Khouradadbi. So he described in details the activities of Jewish merchants named Al-Radaniya, who speak Arabic, Persian, Greek, Slavonic, and trade in slaves, among them eunuchs, silk, brocade, furs, swords, and spices. Their four itineraries connected the ports of Southern Europe, Pharangia to North Africa and the Near East, and continue further eastward to Sindh and India, from where they imported spices back to the Mediterranean markets. So I'm sorry I didn't tell you that beforehand, but on the map you can see in blue, without arrows, unfortunately because I forgot to put them, the Viking itineraries. And the 14 years of the Al Radania, where is this? Okay, are in green. So one terrestrial itinerary, this one. The second one is across the Mediterranean here, in which they take the caravan, because there's no Suez Canal, of course. The third one goes through Antioch, and from there to the Euphrates to Baghdad. And the fourth one is contouring Byzantium, this one. The fact that these traders were Jews do not need to surprise us. As a discriminated religious minority, Jews were restricted in buying slaves in Christian and Muslim countries, and were limited in their possibility to convert their slaves to Judaism. They relied heavily on the international slave trade. Ecclesiastical writers expressed their opposition against selling Christian slaves and slaves in general to Jewish and Muslim traders. This was met with bans signed between Byzantium and Venice on collaboration with slave and armor traders from Muslim lands. Such harsh reactions revealed the religious factor that oriented the slave traders further to the peripheries of their inhabited world. This explained the scale of the slave trade in Africa and also in Eastern Europe. If in the 9th century the Rus were raiding and trafficking the local Slavic population for the slave markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate, when their elite became Christian, they adopted the Byzantine norm that prohibited the enslavement of co-religionists. The treaties that Byzantium signed with the Rus in the 10th century reveals a joint front against the enslavement of members of both sides. Nevertheless, the Rus traders were still suppliers of slaves to Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, which they procured further to the east. There they joined the Bulgars of the Volga, as reported by Ibn Fadlan in his diplomatic mission. The expansion of monotheism beyond the Mediterranean and the Near East regions therefore oriented the slave trade towards the pagan population that were found further and further to the European northeast and the sub-Saharan south. There was a global economic rationale to this map. So, humans were an expensive merchandise, type of merchandise. Prices of European male slaves varied between 20 gold coins in Constantinopolis and 33 gold dinars in Egypt and Syria for European slaves. The prices of African slaves were lower, ranging between 13 to 25 dinars. This difference was probably due to the longer itineraries and complex trade network and taxes. Taxes is a very important issue here. Byzantium imposed heavy taxes on traders who crossed its seas, 10% of a slave's average price, which was huge for a caravan or a ship. This truly increased the price of human merchandise. Moreover, the Byzantine customs system functioned as a commercial barrier and forced the merchants who aimed at the Caliphate markets to detour Byzantine lands and seas. And this explained the long itineraries of the Radania instead of traveling directly from the source of the slave of the Sakaliba in Eastern Europe to the markets that they were aiming at. It was just a question of taxes. What was the state of taxes in the international commerce in the Caliphate for comparison this period? So in the 8th century, Omar II prohibited taxes on trade in order to encourage international commercial activities. A century later, a text of Ubayd al-Qasim ibn Salam states the taxes of 2.5% for Muslim traders, 5% for dhimmi merchants, and 10% for foreign Byzantines, Rum in the text. Although these regulations are attributed to Omar al-Khattab, they most probably reflect the reality of the time of the author, mid-9th century. This also explains why the Rus slave traders were arriving to Baghdad, pretended, in the words of Ibn Khouradadbi, to be Christians and to pay the capitation as such, that is, as dhimmi, half as what they needed to pay. So customs and tolls oriented the slave traders to look for itineraries that will reduce the price of the merchandise. Can this rationale links European and African sides of the medieval map of human trafficking. In other words, were Africans enslaved and trafficked because the Sakaliba were too expensive in merchandising the caliphate? Whatever the reason may be, the slave trade became not only a means of an international forced movement and domination over women and men, but also a means to connect between economies. The result was an international commercial nexus. The entire commercial dynamics of the medieval slave trade depended on coercion and trafficking in humans from less developed economies in the Northeast, Eastern Europe, the Steppe, the Caucasus, and the Northwest, the Baltic, the British Isles. This nexus allowed less developed economies to connect to the richer societies in a global dynamics of distribution of wealth. In other words, human merchandising was a means, even the main means, for the development of less advanced economies. The Vikings, the Rus, the Khazars, the Bulgar Khanate of the Volga are examples for rulers who advanced their economy and state organizations thanks to the trade, including the trade of humans. And the finding of the project Dirham for Slaves has exemplified this. So you can see that the dirham that were found in this project. So what about the commercial markets of the Sub-Sahara and the Sahel? Was their economic success dependent on the traffickings of Africans from the Sub-Saharan to the markets from Al-Andalus to Iraq? Here too, the economic expansion of the slave trade went hand in hand with the conversion of these regions to Islam. Indeed, the Ibadi played a leading role in converting the kings of the Sudan. Unlike northeastern Europe, we don't have findings of hoards of gold and silver coins. We do have literary sources. For example, Siyar al-Mashayikh from the 12th century, as well as Kitab al-Siyar of the 16th century, Ahmed ibn Sa'id Shamahi, bring a story attributed to the second half of the 10th century. A poor merchant arrived to, so this is the map. Again, it's not on the original map because I didn't think that I would go that far south. So a poor merchant arrives to Tadi Makkah, here, from Jarib in Tunisia, up there. He has only a sack of dates, which he exchanges on its way. Each date for 1 dirham, for 1 dinar, makes a fortune and settles in Tadi Makkah. Becomes rich to the point that every year he sends from Tadi Makkah back 16 purses containing 500 dinars each to distribute to the people of his partner's wilaya. Of course, in the Trans-Saharan trade, gold moved also from south to north, as we just heard. Yet, what the story of the rich merchant from Tadi Makkah tells us is that there was another apparatus central to the trade, dinars, which were not only gold, but also coins. The excavation in Tadi Makkah, so a souk in Mali, reveals three gold coin molds that were dated to the mid-9th century, from the mid-9th to the mid-10th century, published by Sam Nixon, Thilo Hen, and Maria Filomena Guerra. Al-Bakri, everyone cites, indeed mentions the dinars in Tadi Makkah, which he describes as of pure gold without any stamp. No dinars were actually excavated in the site. Yet the story, along with the 3 molds, invite us to reflect on a significant possible contribution that the trade in gold and in humans could have provided to the local economic dynamics of the cities of Sub-Sahara, through which they could become wealthier, coins of international currency. And I want to get to another example, which is Audagust. Audagust is another example. It is also mentioned as an important commercial destiny of Ibadi. Ibn Khawkal, Ibn Khawkal describes it as an oasis inhabited by non-Muslim nomads and a source for raids on the Sudan. In the 10th century, its inhabitants are Berbers who convert probably to Islam. Audagust, which is identified probably as the archaeological site of Tegdagust in Mauritania, exports slaves and gold to the north and imports salt, copper, and luxurious copper vessels from the mines of Morocco. It becomes, in consequence, a trading center. Again, al-Bakri mentions a check, sack, of 42,000 dinars issued by Muhammad ibn Ali Sadoun from Audagust for the recipient Abu Yitzhaq Ibrahim ibn Abdallah from Sijil Massa. As François-Xavier Fauvelle explained, this bill of exchange or debt receipt not only testifies to the profitable trade between the two cities, but should also be understood as an investment, even of a company or a credit house with financial means and foundations. It reveals not only the prosperity that the slave trade brought to the city, but also the financial infrastructure that developed in consequence. So, to conclude, it is impossible to estimate the number of men, women, and children who were enslaved, trafficked, and forced to a life away from their country, people, and family in the Middle Ages. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, so appallingly documented, we have little concrete numerical evidence before the early modern period. However, societies which had the means to acquire foreigners did so, and on a larger scale, in order to use these people in different economic functions and social strata. Indeed, forced migration and enslavement proved to be in the Middle Ages two sides of the same coin. Enslavement depended on forced migration in order to provide means of socioeconomic expansion, while forced migration depended on the slave markets and the demand for the enslaved people. Religion determined the movement of these activities and oriented them towards the pagan population of Northern Europe, the steppe, and the Trans-Saharan South, while using transnational itineraries that spread throughout Central and Southern Europe, the North Sea, Mesopotamia, and the Trans-Sahara and the Mediterranean, of course. Enslaving and forced migration of the enslaved were the means to create a global economic map of exchanges. Humans were by far the more profitable merchandise that less developed economies could offer to participate in this map. They constituted the largest and most expensive share of the international trade. Pagan Slavs, Bulgars, and Sudans who were, according to Al-Yaqubi, I state, sell their people without any pretext of war, stopped to do that once converted to either Christianity or Islam. They could no longer enslave those who became their own. This provided a rationale to the expansion of the medieval slave trade map and made it completely dependent on forced migration and coercions of pagans, who were, of course, converted once enslaved. The migration enforced on those women, men, girls, and boys became imperative in order to participate in the international economic map. The violent forced migration constituted, therefore, the main financial portion of the international trade. It was used for both the development of less advanced medieval economies and the geopolitical and economic expansion of medieval civilizations. The means for all that was, unfortunately, human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this impressive lecture. We still have a few minutes for a number of comments, questions. Please, Galia. Just a minute. Wait the mic. Okay.
Thank you, Yuval. It was really interesting. I was wondering, have you found any similarities in political institutions of the societies that were most active in the slave trade? And if you did do that, can you compare between those in the African areas that you studied and in other parts of the world?
You want to collect other questions?
I'll answer that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question. I didn't check into the African part yet, But I did compare between the caliphate and different kinds of Muslim states like the Fatimids and the Abbasid and Umayyad and Byzantium, and the Muslim political entities share a lot, but not so much with Byzantium as far as the political structure is concerned. The use of slave as like an entourage of the ruler in order to provide some kind of, I don't know if we follow David Ayalon thesis of the buffer zone between the population, or to create a certain kind of an elite which is completely up to the loyal to the ruler, is not so much found in Byzantium. But there is other functions there. And I think that the most important thing is not only to look at the political, but also on the social economical structure. And then you find real similarity. You find the enslaved in function in both agriculture, large agriculture, and also small agriculture, and also in urban manufacture. And also in this, like what the anthropologists have taught us, anthropologists of Africa actually taught us, and that it's like it functions as an artificial form of kinship, right? So and the expansion of the small unit, socioeconomic family unit, becomes completely dependent in acquiring more people.
So thank you very much.
Do it briefly, Ruben.
All right, both of us, very quickly. So thank you for the contextualizing Africa in the larger system. I would make two small comments. One, the Ibn Butlan that you had at the beginning, I can't imagine anybody took that seriously. That's entertainment at best. That's adab. That's my opinion anyway, having looked at the text. And the other thing is, with that beautiful map and very informative, I think we're missing one route, which is from Trans-Saharan into the center of the caliphate, and then, of course, to the further west. That's the main route for Turks from the steppe.
So first of all, for your second question, which is easier, you're absolutely right. This is what happened when you invited Byzantinists, of course. So we lack few. Well, there's more. It's a project that already in this, I don't know, the 10th year now. So. Of course, there is the eastern part and from Trans-Saharan, which is recorded in the sources, which I didn't put on the map. This is one thing. The other thing about the adab of Ibn Butlan, I do not agree. Even if you don't think that this is the image of the market in Baghdad, I mean, he does not invent the origin of slaves, right? Otherwise, and this is the important thing. Yeah, and he writes a manual for the title is a guidance to purchase slaves. Yeah, so he explains why slaves from Mecca and Medina, right? So it is a woman slave that passes a few years in Medina and Mecca, and then right.
Okay, last comment, please.
Youval, thank you so much for this really fascinating perspective, which is notoriously absent from mainstream historiography. Just a quick question. You mentioned a Jewish guy who was involved in slave trade, and you mentioned that he spoke Persian, Arabic, and Slavonic as well, which made me think right away about the possibly Caspian context. Do you think there is a chance it might actually be in other words, I mean, do you ever try to associate him with possible Khazar context, because in which case he is no longer can be considered as a suppressed minority, because at some point it did become a religion of the elite among the Khazars.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It allows me to elaborate more a bit on it's not a guy, it's Al-Radaniya. It's a group of merchants, and there are so many, so much scholarship, on this, whether they existed or not, and whether he invented it or not. I did not want to get into the question of their existence. I just wanted to place them on the map and see if it makes sense, these long itineraries, and how they fit in with the other sources. And actually, they have a rationale. So this is one thing. Your point of the Khazar is very important, and you can see the Khazars are, this, a gray line here. from around Kiev to Itil, and we do have evidence on the supply of slaves from the Caspian to Iraq. So the Khazar, actually, what they do is they take taxes. They learn what Byzantium had, practiced in the even before the 8th century, but 8th and 9th century, and they do the same in the 10th century. They make a fortune out of the Russian trade in slave, and later on, as you know, the Rus just destroys Itil and take over and everything else. About the Jewish merchants in the Khazar kingdom, unfortunately I don't have any evidence.
Thank you very much to the two speakers of this session.